Hi there. My name is Ishmael Hope. I'm moderating this discussion, the Gaff Hook, Native audiences and Native storytellers and their audiences then and now. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce this panel. But I'd first just like to start off with a couple quotes to help shape this discussion. This is a quote from A.P. Johnson in the book Hatu Nagu Yis that Dick and Nora did. Here, his Tlingit name was Ichtik Ish, and this was recorded in 1971. He was a Kiks Adi elder from 1896 to 1986. Tlingit ayu ye yana kech ye ide kwa tan kayuk atangi hinyich kayan nagut kayach yati kech a tin hinwonk uwach agi khatayu du kech kay akat ach achesh hasht agak Agakin gunchish chade khanayu agakin chayu kawahaye khat duin nas teach yewe yati kayu atange chayu kawahaye yu atank duin nas teach. A person will often say, I'm going to speak to you. Public speaking is like a man walking along a river with a gaff hook. He lets his gaff hook drift over a salmon swimming at the edge of the river. When he hooks on it, the salmon way over there becomes one with him. This is what oratory is. Even speech delivered at a distance becomes one with someone. And with that, why don't we open up? We thought we'd like to start off with enthralling you and especially ourselves with our life histories, our heartbreaking life histories. No, we'll try to give you as much content as possible. And if you guys just have anything to say as a way of introducing yourself, and then we'll get to the discussion.
Let me see. I celebrate our Tlingit literature by writing, transcribing, and translating them. It's a real slow work and very difficult, but I have my editor. And I am his editor when it comes to Tlingit. So we work at Tlingit this way. I was interested in Tlingit, especially Hatuanago is the part that is memorial for Jim Marks, which was my uncle, and my father did the memorial potlatch for him. At this potlatch, there was about 5 or 6 speakers who did oratory for the grieving family. And they're beautiful. I'm sure some of you people have read it. And while working on this beautiful speeches, I really got hooked on them. And I would think about it at night and early in the morning. It was just holding me. I wasn't getting anywhere, though. But I finally broke through and did Jessie Dalton. She wasn't easy. She was really hard. to try and work with. But I came through with a rough draft. Rough drafts are really rotten. That was my work. And Dick made me proofread. And we rewrote it, and rewrote it, and rewrote it. I can't remember how many drafts we did. But anyway, I'm glad I did that. And in between working with these drafts of Tlingit oratory, Dick made me read Homer and other literatures from Europe. And it was really nice. I could relate to it, especially when it came to the fights. I guess it reminded me of stories that were told to me by my uncles, not especially to me, but to each. They told these stories to each other, my uncles and my grandfather and my father. They told them to each other, and I would listen. I was an eavesdropper when I was a kid. You know, I'd listen to everything. I still do. And by listening, I'd stay awake at nights, kind of falling asleep. And I would hear these stories that they told, which I went out and asked about them when we went to the field in 1970, 71. And we were based in Sitka. And I would go to the villages where I knew there were storytellers. And Dr. Krauss had hired us, Michael Krauss, to go to the field. And I visited with these storytellers, and some of them were so generous, and others not so. But that was all right, because I had plenty to work with the guys that were generous. And in the long run, when they knew they were passing, a couple of them, one of them asked for me to come and record him. And the other one came to me where I was working at Sea Alaska with Dick. And he brought a little valise full of tapes, and he recorded with me again. So these good things happened because when we collected, we'd read to these guys, these men who were storytellers. We'd read to them what they gave us after I transcribed and translated. And they liked them. They liked them. In fact, one of the guys, when we were going back to Anchorage, we stopped at Teslin, where we collected a story about the brown bear. And I read that to him in Tlingit, and he said, "Boy, that's the best story I ever heard." And then, let me tell you the rest of it. So we stayed there a night, and we rented a cabin from him with seaweed and fish eggs. We didn't have any money. We still don't. Anyway, we did that, and that was the kind of field work we did. And maybe I'll stop there. let these guys do their thing.
Nora didn't mention she's also a great fan of Icelandic sagas and Beowulf, and I put that on the reading list, and she figured that anything that's got a funeral in it can't be all bad. Anything with a genealogy has got to be even better.
Speeches.
Speeches, yeah. There's Icelandic sagas. Nobody dies without a pithy speech, just before they go. So the guy comes out with a spear in his belly, and he has to make a brief, pithy speech to be recorded. Anyhow, I'm Dick Dauenhauer. I sometimes hang out my shingle as a retreaded English teacher. My background is in European languages, and this is also interesting because I've been trained as in German and Russian, and I've taught both of those one semester each. And the rest of it has just been doing stuff that I have absolutely no training in, which has been kind of fun, because when I came to Alaska 40 years ago this year, one of the things that intrigued me was always languages, as I'd majored in have degrees in German and Russian and studied classical Greek and things like that. So I really was interested in oral literature, and then also the idea of Alaska Native literatures. So one of the things that intrigued me very much is how it was being treated in schools and universities, and I found that it usually wasn't, or if it was relegated as children's literature. So I think a lot of this, the idea of figuring the other guy's literature as children's literature is essentially kind of a racist thing. So pretty much what I've done in the last 40 years has been applied folklore and applied linguistics, trying to work on materials that can be of use in the community. One of the things that excites me theoretically is that we're in the work that we're doing, we're at a juncture of orality and literacy. And these are very exciting moments, I think, in literature. When you look historically at, say, the first person to write down Gilgamesh, or to write down Beowulf, or to write down the Homeric epics, is that you had a thriving oral literature, and then you have this new technology of writing, and at some point the same thing with the material that's in the, especially the Old Testament. To a certain extent, the New Testament is fascinating when you look at it as biography. How do you write the biography of this guy and put the bits and pieces together? So what we have then is these classics like Gilgamesh. We have the Greek anthology. We have the Homeric materials, Beowulf. All of these, and I think with a lot of where we are with Alaska Native literature and First Nations is in the last century, some of what Robert touched on in his talk yesterday, people writing these down for the first time, and we're sort of at the part of that, in a sense, that great tradition, working with the really the last generation for us of people who were raised exclusively in Tlingit, and the storytellers, and doing our best. So we're very interested in all of these questions of how do you record these things, how do you transcribe them, how do you translate them, how do you present them to an audience, how do you get them into community use, and also some other theoretical questions we can maybe come back to, like mutual suspicions. What we have encountered in our 40 years of work is typically a Tlingit reaction to books is very one of suspicion, because these are kind of strange things, and once it's on a book, you don't have control over the audience anymore, and you don't know where these things are going. Conversely, the schools are tremendously suspicious of oral literature. And this is not only us. I mean, Lord had the same problem at Harvard, trying to get folks convinced that maybe the Bible was oral. UAS? I know that place. And saying, that maybe the Homeric epics were not composed at a typewriter, but somebody composed these things orally and they were written down. So I think with that, I'll stop and pass the microphone. So that's in a nutshell, what's engaged me very much over the last 40 years is trying to teach or to treat indigenous oral literature with the same respect that we treat the classics of our own Western tradition. And that if you treat an Alaska Native story or speech the same way you approach John Donne or Shakespeare, it'll come out sounding like John Donne and Shakespeare and not like, Mary Had a Little Lamb or something like that. And I also, when Nora mentioned she had worked with these speeches from her father's memorial, that changed my life. And I can come back to this theme later if anybody's interested in that, because I looked at this and said, this is as great as metaphysical poetry in English tradition. This is as great as a Shakespeare sonnet in their use of metaphor and simile. This is powerful stuff, and I'd never seen this before. I was familiar with some of the stories, but nobody had recorded oratory live within the tradition. I mean, typically, as an outsider, I would sit there, I'd listen to a speech. The next day you go to somebody and say, well, what was Uncle Harry saying yesterday? Oh, and they'd such and such. But to actually have it live in performance, transcribed by somebody who knew the voices in the community, and that was different. And so that changed my whole life, really, to become aware of the greatness of that. So I shall pass.
My name is Robert Bringhurst. My story is not much different from Dick's, with the very crucial difference that I am not married to Nora. And so I'm married to a wonderful woman from whom I have learned a great deal, but not what you have learned from her. Unlike these wonderful people, I work almost entirely with old materials, recordings that I have not made, transcriptions that were made in many cases long before I was born. There is some wonderful material there, sitting around, mostly ignored, in at least 100 native North American languages, at least 100. There are wonderful archives of this material, the one in Philadelphia in the American Philosophical Society, where I have spent months and years of my life. Another great archive that used to be in Washington, D.C., is now a little ways outside there in Maryland. And there are some other important archives, one in Berkeley, a smaller one in Seattle. They show up here and there. You put all these things together, manuscripts and typescripts and old sound recordings, and you have an enormous library of Native American materials that is simply being ignored by the schools, being ignored by the cultural institutions, the institutes for the humanities and so forth. And sometimes people in the Native communities know about these things, because sometimes there are copies of the materials in the Native communities. The speakers are very often remembered by their descendants. But these texts were, in almost all cases, collected by linguists who came in from outside and who then went back outside and took their stuff with them, who may or may not have remembered to leave something behind with the Native people who taught them what they learned, who gave them what they took. And the material was often collected for linguistic rather than literary reasons. That is, people were just looking at language for language's sake. So they needed sentences, but they didn't really care what the sentences said. I am a literary person, and I do care what the sentences say, because sometimes they say a great deal. This particularly happens in circumstances just like the one that Nora and Dick have both spoken about, this memorial where the system is closed, where the speakers and the listeners are both inside the culture. A lot of the material that has been collected in Native American communities has been collected by outsiders, and they made themselves the audience. So they came in and they asked people to tell them things, tell them stories, give them sentences. But they didn't know anything. See, they were outsiders. They didn't know where they were, and so they had to be treated like children, because the mentally, culturally, they were infants, even if they were actually 40, 50 years old. Sometimes we get lucky. I was describing a case yesterday in which the young linguist John Swanson went into the Haida communities in Skidegate and Masset. He hired a Haida man in his 20s, Henry Moody, to be the listener, to be the audience. And then he hired older people to tell things to Henry Moody. So Swanson's just sitting on the sidelines, and the teller and the listener are both inside the culture. Swanson was probably luckier than he knew. He had hired a young man who was about to inherit the headship of the village of Puno. So this young man needed a postgraduate education in Haida culture. He was old enough, and he was going to inherit a position of authority. He was going to become a clan leader. He needed to be taught what he didn't already know. And Swanson got to sit on the side with his notebook and his pencil and record that education. There are other occasions like this where, we just get really lucky. The way they worked was that the old storyteller would speak a few sentences, and then the younger Haida, Henry, would repeat back what he had been told. This gave the old man an opportunity to make sure that the younger Haida had understood exactly what he said, because he was repeating it, and it gave Swanson time to write it down, because this was before tape recorders. So he just had a pencil and notebook, and he got to hear every word twice in two different voices, the old man's voice, the young man's voice. And they worked this way 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, for a year. They did a lot. And then Swanson went over these transcripts with the younger man, who had heard and repeated each one of these words, and wrote in a kind of English gloss on the Haida text. And then after a year in the Haida country, Swanson went back to Washington, D.C. and sat there with his typewriter and typed all this stuff up. We could have been a little luckier than we are. Swanson didn't understand the incredible value of his raw transcripts, and so he destroyed the field notebooks after he'd typed up what they contained. That's a huge treasure that disappeared. But we got his typed, corrected version, and that's a lot. Well, there are other examples of this kind of wealth that has come from the old days, from native communities in North America, and those are the materials that I have been working with for the last many, many years. I am deeply concerned about the political implications of all this. We all know that the colonial enterprise has done enormous damage to the native nations of North America, but What we sometimes forget, you see, is that those colonizers have colonized everybody, not just native people, but themselves too. They turn everybody into second-class citizens. They treat the heritage that they brought with them from Europe in the same sort of disrespectful way that they treat indigenous culture. How many universities can you find in North America now where they still teach Latin and Greek? How many students can you find who are studying what used to be the core of a European education? It's almost disappeared. See, the old ways are being devalued and forgotten everywhere you look. It doesn't just happen in native villages. Everywhere. How many of you ever heard Homer in Greek? But that used to be the basis of, you got a few lucky people around here, but I mean,
Not from Homer, but
well, I mean, the fact is the Europeans have, for hundreds of years, actually deliberately mispronounced their classical Greek too. So I mean, they make it easy for themselves. It's a tonal language like Tlingit, and they take the tones out and make everything flat. You know? Who should do a little Greek?
you should,
Why
you
not?
should do it.
Why don't Andra moen nepe muoso polu tropon hosmala polla plankte petroies hieron tolietrone persen polondan tropon iren aste kaino onegno. That's the opening of a story called the Odyssey. Story of Odysseus going on his adventures around the Mediterranean. It used to be that everybody in the east end of the Mediterranean knew this story the way everybody in this country knew their raven stories, stories of Kagatkuk. And it's been lost now, pretty much. It's gone. They don't teach Greek very much in the universities. They don't teach it at all in the lower schools anymore. Well, I don't want to lose these things. I don't want to lose the cultural inheritance in Haida or in Navajo or in Tlingit or in Kwakwala or in Greek or Latin either. All that literature was oral. It got written down, and because it got written down, it could be saved. But now they want to replace the libraries full of books with TV sets and computer terminals that don't know anything, can't pronounce any words. The very first thing that happened when this session opened, young Ishmael Hope, who was not raised speaking Tlingit, opened the book that these people made and read some words in his ancestral language. That's what books are for. I mean, that's what this whole session is all about. You just saw it happen. He did it. It works. This is great news.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to talk about language, and I'm opening up The Tree of Meaning with an excellent foreword by Jim Harrison, written by Robert Bringhurst. And this came from, I'm going to open it up to prosodies of meaning. I actually had to look up how to, I was calling it prosodies for a while. I looked it up, how to pronounce that. Let's see. So language. Language is, by definition, a self-transcending medium, and fascinating, therefore, in itself. But I'm fascinated more when language seems to transcend not just language, but also those who speak and understand it. when language seems to transcend not just language, but also those who speak and understand it. Italicized by me. These are moments when language permits or propels us to the verge of saying and of hearing more than we thought we knew or were able to say. More, perhaps, than we thought possible either to utter or to understand. This happens sometimes when a person is driven to scream, reaching beyond the boundaries of language. It also happens sometimes when someone sings a song or tells a story, passing through the heart of language to a place that is, as Melville says, not down in any map. True places never are. So that's one from your essay, Robert. And so my next question to the panel really is about language, is about literature when it bounds outside of what we thought we knew. You know, we were just talking, language can, it can, you know, we're not in control of it. And, you know, I think it's a fundamental experience to have that moment where you're propelled beyond what you thought you knew or understand or were able to utter or to hear. So I think let's just talk a little bit about that experience. I think it could be an intensely personal thing. You know, what's it like for you guys? Whoever wants to take it.
When I eavesdropped to the storytellers while I was falling asleep, I could visualize what was happening, like a movie. Maybe I already been seeing movies. So that helped me to understand it a little bit more, but for some reason I couldn't understand everything. I only understood a little more after I took Dick Dauenhauer's long semester. I really enjoy literature. I like all of that Dick mentioned, and also Homer, Odyssey, where is it Hector that got dragged around to the palace? Iliad. Yeah, oh man. Whew. I think they had that made into a movie where one of the young Hollywood guys acted in. No, Achilles, he got it in the heel. That was so Tlingit, you know, that his spirit was in his heel. I really enjoyed that part. It was similar to how we understand Tlingit. I really liked it. Anyway, here's Dick, the master.
Hardly. I'm going to pass to Robert quickly, but I just have one thing that came to me. The only course I ever took in creative writing was from Philip Booth at Syracuse, and he was a student of Robert Frost, so I sort of feel like I'm a grandchild of Robert Frost. And one of the things he said is a poem is an act of discovery. So if you sit down to write a poem and you know where you're going with it, it's going to be pretty crummy. And so really I found whenever I write that, you know, and it comes from somewhere. So I think there's something to be said about these invocations to the muse that you begin with the Iliad and the Odyssey and other things that you really don't know where it comes from and whether it's, you know, brain chemistry or what. But you start with something. You start with an image. You start with a word. You may start with a sound. You may start with an idea, a concept. But somewhere something happens, and it kind of takes on a life of its own. And so that's kind of when Ish mentioned this transcendency. That's sort of the thing that came to my mind. So that's the first and, at the moment, last thing that came to my mind, so I'll pass over to Robert.
I have a good friend, a writer, a novelist, who occasionally publishes short stories. There was a time in her life when she wrote quite a number of short stories because the novels were not selling very well and she needed money, and it used to be possible in Canada to sell short stories to the CBC radio and magazines quite readily. I'm not telling you her name because what I have to say about her is not entirely complimentary, and maybe she'd rather I left her name out of this story. But I discovered that I liked her novels a great deal, and the short stories just didn't seem to me to have it. One time we did a reading tour together, and so we were in each other's close company for 2 or 3 weeks, and I got a chance to sort of ask enough questions to try to find out what was going on here without just saying, I don't like your short stories and I like your novels. Why is that? I just sort of asked her how she proceeded in these two different genres, and she told me that she wrote the short stories only because she needed money, and she would have an idea and she would know exactly how the story was going to turn out, and she would just sit down with a cup of coffee or a glass of gin and write from the beginning to the end. That was it. That was done, and she'd get her $1,000 or whatever it was. But the way she wrote novels was that she had some things that she wanted to understand, and so she started writing about those things. And she didn't know how the novel was going to come out. It was a process of discovery. She was learning things. Apparently, she never learned anything from writing the short stories. And maybe that's why she got paid for writing the short stories. Maybe we live in a culture that really doesn't want us to learn anything. But the novels, they were voyages of discovery. The language told her things she knew but didn't know she knew. Made it possible for her to understand things that she needed to understand, to solve things, to discover things. But it kept on working, right? Because I had the same experience when I read the novels. Something unfolded for me, too, even though I didn't have to go to all the work of writing the book myself. I just sit there and read it. That process of discovery was somehow preserved in the language itself. That's how literature works. That's why these stories, those speeches, continue to have their power. They really are discoveries. There's really something there.
Yeah, sometimes when I read some of this stuff, like Bringhurst's translation of Sky and Qandl, Dick and Nora's translations in Hatuanaguyis and Hashuka, Jessie Dalton, who I think you mentioned her speech, I feel like I could finally breathe again, I'm returning to myself, when I read this stuff. And so we have some guests from a class I'm taking at the university, and the instructor, Kevin Meyer, Literature and the Environment. I think that's about two most pressing, interesting, worthy kind of things to talk about: literature and the environment, and against the backdrop of the colonial, system, literate way of structuring things, those things that we were mentioning earlier. But what about how an oral culture and its literature can interact with the environment, have a symbiosis, as Robert was talking about at the luncheon yesterday, and just help live, hopefully harmoniously. How can oral literature do that with the environment?
Well, when I discovered, when I started to understand what I was working on, I was so unhappy and happy at the same time. Especially when I started to work on Jessie Dalton. I started to understand her. I remember her as not a mean person, but a very strong person. And I avoided getting in contact with people like that in the villages where I came from. I didn't want to be questioned by them. I might tell them my secrets. Anyway, I've been in love with Tlingit from the time I started to work on Jesse and David, all those guys. They're beautiful. And it was me. They were me. What they were saying were what I remembered and what I understood to be my background. Not as a background, but I know it connected me to the people that I worked with, to my grandfather, both sides of my grandparents, because I started to ask questions about them, and the rest of my family, and I hope I remember to record them. I wrote a lot of things, a lot of them are drafts. Anyway, I hope that I remembered to record their names and all that. I'm starting another name list because I don't know where I put the other one. Anyway, it's just got me in its clutches, but it feels good.
Yeah, two immediate things come to my mind, and and there's different genres, but they both deal with literature and the environment. I'll mention one that's maybe more accessible right away. One of our students, Amanda Bremner, many of you know her, and she got an EPSCoR grant to work on a project with animals and the environment and changing environment, and she tape recorded Fred White in Yakutat, and so her current project for me as a directed studies is to transcribe this and translate it with interlinear. And Fred's talking about global warming, but it's not necessarily in those terms, but fascinating images like how did the birds know to nest upriver where it was cooler because it was an incredibly hot summer, and then the dew would collect on the grass and that would drip onto the eggs and keep them from overheating and blowing up and stuff like this. And so it's full of essentially indigenous sensitivity toward nature. I mean, actually almost like a phenomenological thing where you're not going out and measuring with a thermometer, but it's this whole idea of place-based education that we've been working on for many years, that you can actually create your science by experiments like this that you can do right there in fish camp. And so to me, this always made a lot of sense. It would be to base your curriculum not on translating Western concepts of science or math, but looking at what are the indigenous sources and what can we get from that. So that's one example. I was really moved by it. I said, gee, this is really neat. And he goes and talks about bear and deer and things and changing environment. Well, I mentioned one of my favorite stories in our book, SOK. I guess my two favorite stories in there are the Glacier Bay history and then The Woman Who Married the Bear, which is a classic in the Yukon. And I enjoy teaching these stories because like we talked about with writing, being an act of discovery, if it's a good class, it's also an act of discovery. And so I always go into the class, having done this for many, many years, with a certain repertory of ideas. But if people who have never read these things for the first time are careful readers, invariably they come up with things that I'd never thought about. And so that's exciting. So you have this text, and it's a very Socratic method. I mean, you're sitting there with the text between you or in the midst of you and talking about patterns and what do you notice in the story. And I guess what is so profound to me about the Woman Who Married the Bear is this whole idea of, in a sense, loss of innocence. You can't go home again, once you've experienced something. And in this case, of course, she, a typical Tlingit pattern, you shouldn't not only do bad things, but you shouldn't even think bad thoughts because the animals are infinitely superior to us and they can read our thoughts. Great image too. If I ever do a movie version of this, the storyteller Tom Peters from Teslin describes the thoughts are like coming to the bear's cave are like flashlight beams coming in, and just imagine this bear and he's doing his kung fu stuff and reflecting the thoughts, and that's why humans can't find bear dens because your thoughts are going and the bear is reflecting them back or deflecting them. And so anyhow, you're not supposed to even think, much less utter bad things. Well, the girl utters bad things and then gets to have a close encounter of the third kind, which is again a typical Tlingit pattern with an out-of-body experience, essentially, with another form of life, and then ultimately returns with spiritual power that's been gained that allows you to communicate between humans and the animal world. So we think about, well, why is this story so powerful? And say, well, it's kind of silly. I mean, people don't go off and marry animals. So there's something else going on here. Kitty McClellan in her monograph on this points out the same problem of, well, why are we obsessed with Oedipus? I mean, isn't it normal to kill your father and marry your mother? I mean, what's the big deal? That there must be something going on here in Western civilization that causes a certain discomfort when, the guy's killed his father and married his mother, no big deal. Well, obviously there's some kind of a big deal going on. So the same thing with the bear. This guy's got to make a choice, and it's a very subtle one for most of us coming from the outside. Does he kill his brother-in-law? Because the brothers-in-law go to rescue their sister, who's been carried off by this tall, dark, handsome stranger. And so now, what does he do? Does he kill his brother-in-law, or does he let himself be killed? The great existential crisis, and he lets himself be killed. But there's a deal here. There's a covenant. You've got to do it in a certain way. You must sing this song. You must take care of my skin. You've got to do all of these things, which are right-handed down to the present day. And I've mentioned this in classes. When I was driving to Alaska 40 years ago, we stopped somewhere in northern BC or Yukon. It was sundown, and I just stopped by the roadside for a rest. And there was kind of a shelter off, and there was a smoldering fire, and there doesn't seem to be anybody around. So we kind of looked at this shelter. They had a bear skin, and it was facing toward the sunset, and it was a smoldering fire. And so later on, when we went to Teslin and recorded the story, this is part of when you kill the bear says, you got to take care of my skin in a certain way. You've got to do these certain things. So it's very, very profound. And then also when you think about this now, you're coming back to environment. Why this anxiety with bears? So much so that in Tlingit, traditionally, you wouldn't utter the word bear. You would talk about the powerful one of the forest. In Russian, there's not a word for bear. It's a euphemism, honey eater. Beowulf is probably the same thing, like a honey scarfer or something like this. So we're talking about hibernation things. But why this thing with bears? And I have a funny story about it. Better not go there. When I was with Khanty people in Siberia, again, where this guy was using all kinds of euphemisms. And it was I wasn't getting it, but it was actually, he didn't want to utter the word bear. He just didn't want to say it because it was too powerful. So he was using these euphemisms that I wasn't quite getting. But coming back to this, I mean, when you look at it, we like the same things. We like fish, we like berries, everything that we like, bears like. So we're competing with them for the same ecological niche. And also, I've never hunted bear or skinned bear, but people tell me that the anatomies are remarkably human. And when you're done with this, there it is. And then ultimately, we have this probably 99% of the same biological stuff going on in terms of body cells and DNA and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So it's really, when you start thinking about these things, I find them incredibly profound. And in almost all of these stories, again, the Kat story from Ketchikan, the man who married the bear, there's similar things, and land animals and seals and birds, and you could do this Levi-Strauss analysis on just great things. So that's just one example of, to me, in the stories, they're operating on several levels, and I think certainly the environmental, ecological. And the underlying idea is that there are spirits in everything, and one needs to be careful about how one treats the environment, because there are spirit forces at work, and we're part of that. We're not in control of it, but we need to live with it.
How many English novels do you know, or plays, or poems, in which the animals play a really important part?
Old Yeller?
There are a few. There's Moby Dick.
Moby Dick is
Animal Farm, yeah. Well, no, I mean a really important part. English, sorry?
A white fang?
Yeah. Well, I think I've made my point, which is that English literature is mostly indoor literature. Right? It is mostly concerned with human beings and the interactions between human beings. There are 100,000 novels about social situations in human life for every novel in which a non-human makes a serious appearance. In Haida oral literature, the animals are always there. The places are always alive. The forest is as important, much more important, in fact, than the human beings in the story. The killer whales are important in the story, the wolves. In other words, Native literature has a larger view of things. It is more philosophical. It does not pretend that you can shut the door and leave nature outside and central heating will take care of all your problems. is alive to the fact that we share the planet with a whole lot of non-human creatures, and we better stay on reasonable terms with them or we won't be here anymore. That's environmental literature. I mean, there are a few English poets, Edward Thomas, for example, who show a serious interest in the non-human creatures of the world, but they are very few. And Edward Thomas is not sort of one of the first poets you will meet in most English classes. The Haida myth tellers are always listening to the real world, to the forest, to the ocean, the life on the beach. They speak of themselves and their people as surface birds. Creatures, us humans, who can't go down into the water the way the cormorants can, the loons, who can't go up into the air the way the loons and the cormorants can't dive like the sea lions. Just feeble people can't even go into the ground like the bears. We live in a very thin part of the world, and this is a literature that is interested in the depth and the breadth of this world. The other thing that's very important to me about this is that oral literature is real in the sense that the forest is real. You know, it's not fastened down the way things are in a book. If you lose it, it's gone. There's the heart of the world beating right there. That's real. I know people in Toronto who have been trying to revive the art of storytelling. They were led by a wonderful old woman named Alice Kane, an Irish woman who grew up in a world where oral culture was still alive. She also learned to read and write, and later in her life she made her living as a librarian, but oral culture stayed alive in her. And she could tell stories. In many cases, they were stories that she had read in books, but when she told them, she wasn't repeating what she'd read in the book. She made the stories come alive. Another lesson in what books are really for. They're just a kind of halfway house between one oral culture and another. Well, of course, a lot of people who came along to these sessions in Toronto and wanted to be storytellers were terrified. They didn't know how. So they went home and they memorized something from a book, and they would come in and recite it. Well, it's not the same. That's not oral literature. It's not recitation. It's not reading from a book or repeating from a book. Look, you can use the book to get the oral culture back. You just saw Ish doing that. But you don't stop there. That's just one step. And that's the relation between literature and the environment, is that real literature is part of the environment. Oral literature is real in that sense.
Okay, I have a little footnote to Robert's comment here about the song that was bleeding through from the other side there is another classic of literature and the environment. And the lyrics are, there's some kind of a shorebird, and as it's been translated as plover or as snipe. It may be the one that James Crippen tells me migrates from here to Hawaii directly, and you can see it in Honolulu at certain times of the year. Anyhow, he's there, and then in the middle of his tracks, I think, are his nieces and nephews, who are they're Raven's nieces and nephews. So there's there's that, and then the next image is stinky, stinky, stinky. And so, what is this going on? It was the first time I heard the song. It's a real peppy song. But it starts off with the plovers or the shorebirds, ravens, nieces and nephews, stinky, stinky. And the image, of course, is the fish have spawned, and they're lying there on the beach, and Raven is just in pig heaven because he's got all of these rotting fish there, and he's just scarfing these things up. And, of course, the other shorebirds are following along in their uncle's literally in their uncle's footsteps. And then that great image, it's a, puke or putrid, or I don't know how you translate that, stinky, stinky, or smelly, I mean, the idea of rotten fish. And these are, of course, the fish, when the tourists come in the summer and they say, can't you do anything to clean up those fish? And they even do the same thing with the glacier. They say, that dirt on the glacier, can't you go out and clean off the glacier? So I just, as the song was coming through, there's another environmental literature of the environment. I mean, all of those images, because when you're inside and you're with your central heating and trying to understand this, all you got to do is walk on the beach here, and you'll get the image right away, but you won't get it in your living room in D.C.
I want to talk a little bit about the literate way of seeing, perceiving, thinking, talking, and an oral way of, and I think we have been talking a lot about this, but for this next question, it'll be about those two things. Harold Innis, the social economist, said that someone who comes out of a literate society, which is most of the people in this room, except for maybe a few elders, Nora, will never understand an oral way of perceiving. And that's a big bummer to me, man. And I mostly agree, but I leave that sliver of hope of actually maybe there is a way in. Maybe there's a way in so we could get to the goods, the stuff that these guys are talking about. So my question is, how, as people maybe who come mostly from a literate society, literate way of seeing, or raised in that way, had it beaten into our heads, and the shamanism and the other stuff beaten out of us, like Nora's talked to me before, how do we get a little closer to the oral way of seeing?
I think one of the more interesting things to me that I did was to read the old stuff like Swanton that you mentioned a lot of. I learned to read them. Boy, they were tough. They didn't look like Tlingit should look, I thought. There were sounds there that he wrote. I couldn't read at first, but then I learned. And then I learned to read Boaz too, and he was okay. And I learned to read Belton, who worked with the guy from Ketchikan, or Lester Roberts. He was a instructor in school, or a superintendent or something like that. He was a very educated Tlingit that worked with Belton. And I wondered how how Belton got interested in all this Tlingit stuff that I knew only as a child. I heard them. I heard Swanton's stories told in the boat, New Annie, and in a tent in the camp. That was really great. And then it renewed my memory. And It was a puzzle to me how they did it. And then when I got hired to teach in Juno Douglas school, I said yes without even thinking. And then I had to have materials, and I didn't have those. And the only thing I could use was when I came on these Bible translations done by the White Cliff translators who spent time in Yangon. They were really great because I could read them. The first word I read was "qat," after struggling through it. "Qat" is a name of a pot, Dutch oven or handle pot. They're all "qat." And I flew 90 miles off the ground because I could read this. And I still wondered how they wrote this. So I'm perplexed about how people get to write these things too. But fortunately, I was satisfied with Nation Stories materials that they produced for Tlingit in Yangon. We used them for Hatuanaguyis. We're still using the same writing system for Russians in Tlingit country, the big book we just finished. We used that writing system. Sometimes some people are writing with their own writing system. Well, I think it's okay if they're just writing it for themselves. But if they're going to let somebody else read it, they're going to have somebody proofread it. Maybe a linguist like Carey and James Crippen, who's sitting by the door, and me, Dick, maybe you. Anyway, it's wonderful to have brains that could do all these things and have people like you understand them. We can understand each other. We're on a level where we can understand the things we're talking about. And maybe you're going to come and read these puzzling books. So, that's about it. I don't know if I...
Yeah, totally. That's good. That's good.
Well, that's a tough question to answer. I don't know if I'm going to answer it, but I'll give it a go. Two things come to mind. First of all, I think when we study oral literature and become aware of the difference in style between the conventions of oral literature and the conventions of kind of essayist literature, or the way we teach composition. So, for example, one of the obvious ones is repetition. You get a lot of this in oral literature. Certain traditions are also composed metrically. Sometimes they'll have singers either with a little fiddle, like in Yugoslavia, or Siberia, like a banjo kind of, and sing. These are like the throat singers and things like that. So that's, in other words, once we're open to the idea that there are different conventions, then we can kind of be open to the idea that some of the stuff really is oral. And I'll give you my favorite example is Genesis. The more I read Genesis, the less I understand. I mean, it's like every other line, there's something in there that makes no sense. And I think it's got to be because we're dealing with the an oral tribal literature from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago or more, and we're missing the footnotes. We're missing a lot of the context. What was going on? And if you were there live, maybe some of those images would come to life. And there's typical would be comparing, say, when Odysseus comes home and the nurse spots the scar. There's a very famous essay about this, the scar of Odysseus. And then all of a sudden you got to go into the boar hunt, and now he got the scar, and on and on and on and on. And compare that, say, to anything in Genesis, Abraham and Isaac. How old was the kid? What kind of knife did he have? You don't know. I mean, this is not a concern. What kind of fruit, and what fruit was it that Eve had in the Garden of Eden? I mean, the folk Bible has it as an apple. I don't think there's an apple in Genesis. But, so, in other words, there are a lot of things there. So, that's one level. The other level I'd like to talk about is entirely different, and that's that we are, in fact, in oral society, and we just don't recognize it because we think we came out of our mother's womb literate. And we think that language is, in terms of writing, most of us were in, I guess now with Sesame Street, it's earlier, but, probably 4 or 5 years old before we started gaining literacy skills. So we forget that essentially that's oral. And we still use, I think, certain skills orally. For example, I'm teaching a folklore course this semester, and the author of the book has one chapter called Surrounded by Folklore. So we're obviously in this oral because we know how to react. We know when to laugh at jokes that our friends tell. We know what jokes we can tell and what ones we shouldn't. So there's something going on there. And I've been thinking about this a lot over the last couple of years because now we're working, our next book is on raven stories. And we wanted to do this as our first book. We thought this would be a shoe-in. And we read our drafts to the students and other people way back in the 80s, and nobody laughed. And we say, well, and we've realized very soon that tragedy is universal, but comedy is not. And so all of the tragedies that we were dealing with, people could understand right away. I mean, like the woman who married the bear, and I mean, all of these, that's understandable. I mean, so if somebody dies, that's a human universal, everybody can understand. But when something is funny, I don't understand Japanese satire because I'd have to know what the straight version is before I would know what the satirical version is. And I remember I'd been living abroad for a period of time. I came back and there's a bumper sticker that said Archie Bunker for president. And I didn't get it. I didn't know who's Archie Bunker. I mean, I hadn't heard of these guys because I was just totally out of it. I mean, even in my own culture, I lost my culture. So I started thinking about that. So if I start off a story, it's November and President Kennedy is flying to Dallas. So we've got historical present. But if I start off, this guy walks into a bar, you immediately know you're being set up for a joke. Why? Because we tend to use the present tense only either in historical narratives for this historical present or telling a funny story. So why then do we translate our raven stories in the past tense in English? So Raven was walking along the beach because we know that if we told that as a joke, we'd tell it in the present tense. So the raven's walking along the beach and he sees this king salmon out there. But when you write it on a page like that, all of a sudden it looks sort of semi-literate because wait a minute, this is serious literature. We've got to put this in the. And so we've been struggling with that, and we've tried a few different translations. Then we started noticing another thing that was to me, very peculiar, and that was the shift between perfectives and imperfectives in Tlingit. So typically the storyteller would start off and then maybe have like Raven flew there. Now he's running around and he's doing this and he's doing that. So all of a sudden we're back to the imperfective or the present tense for the detail. Then next time there's a verb that advances the story, it's in a past tense or a perfective. And so all of a sudden we started looking at maybe this is somehow coding scenes and coding acts and stanzas and stuff like that. So there's a whole area out there that I really wasn't even listening to, but I think it was because I didn't really appreciate that we are, in a sense, in this oral tradition. When everybody knows that you tell jokes in the present tense. You wouldn't say a guy walked into a bar and said to the bartender. It's flat. It's got to be. He goes into the bar, he says to the bartender, hey, such and such. So anyhow, these are kind of fascinating things. There's also a very serious side. It's a little bit beyond this panel, but in sociolinguistics, people in the 80s especially were looking at this idea of ethnographies of speaking. And they were finding that some kids, like when you do an essay, you give kids a word problem in arithmetic, like, with these things where the guy has so many chickens and so many eggs, and every chicken averages so many eggs, how many eggs and stuff like that. And so some of the kids were sort of looking at the answer from within the text, and other groups of kids were looking at everywhere else. They're kind of looking outside the text. Where's the answer going to be? And it turns out a lot of the kids that were more streetwise figure they're not going to get the answer from the text. They're going to get the answer from outside the text. So this had pretty profound pedagogical repercussions about how we were teaching and evaluating students and giving tests. So I think there's more orality around than we like to admit, but it's both ways. So knowing about oral literature has got me looking at some things like Genesis, but then also looking at the way we tell jokes. Has started looking again at how we're translating our Raven stories, and we'll let you know when the book comes out. You'll see what we finally decided.
I think often the best way to make a problem unsolvable is to state it in terms of polar opposites. And people who talk about orality versus literacy often do this. The guys, Harold Innes and Father Ong and other people who say that, you can never go back to the oral world, you can never understand it once you've been fed the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of writing and printing, are all people who in fact are addicted to writing and printing, and what they mean is they're afraid to let go. And if they state this in categorical terms, you, meaning all of us, can't go back again, then they're really safe. They get to have their fear and eat it too. You can. There are innumerable impure cases. Alice Kane, I mentioned, a woman who learned to read and write and who never lost touch with the oral world and who went back into it after a lifetime with books, in the service of books. Alice saw stories in her head and she told them, and other people saw them in their heads when they heard her tell them, and oral literature sprang to life right there in the Toronto Public Library. I'm editing a book right now of stories dictated by an old friend of Dick and Nora's, Ron Scullin. Stories told by a Chippewayan man named Francois Mandeville in 1928 to a Chinese linguist named Li Fangui. Scullin was Li's student toward the end of his life and was given these Chippewayan texts as a challenge and worked with them, thought about them, lived with them for 30 years, translated them twice into English. He learned a great deal from this old Chippewayan man that he never met, who died in 1952. But while Francois Mandeville was a great storyteller, he was not an example of pure oral culture. He was a Métis. That's why I had a French name. His first languages were Chipewyan and French, not just Chipewyan. He married a wife who spoke Dogrib. He traveled around in the service of the Hudson's Bay Company, learning Slavey and other northern Athabascan languages. He worked as a Hudson's Bay factor and trader. He wore thick Harry Potter glasses and dressed to a large extent like a European. He read the Bible in Chipewyan syllabics. He could write French to a certain extent in the normal way. But he also, like Alice Kane, never lost touch with oral culture. And he lived a rich life because he spoke all the languages of the territory where he lived, the indigenous and colonial languages alike. He learned English as well as native French. He heard stories in all of these languages, but he had a good ear. And so it was like a musician who might hear something on the piano and something else on the ukulele and who's not going to mix them up, because they're not easily transposed, and he knows what fits where. He knew where the stories fit, and when he told them well, beautifully. They were well-formed stories. I love these examples of impurity because they help me to understand how wrong Harold Innis was when he said you can't let go of those printed books once you got them. Maybe they couldn't let go of him. Maybe he couldn't let go of them, but you can. You can go back. I think.
Last summer, one of the last things my father did was organize the Honoring Alaska's Indigenous Literature Award. A few years back, I was asking Robert, hey, do you know any people that I might talk to? I'm traveling around the state, talking to elders about Raven stories. Robert suggested Catherine Atla, and on his recommendation, I read her books. They're brilliant. She's a Koyukon Athabascan storyteller. She's amazing. You got to give her a mic, otherwise people can't hear her. And probably you want to have a translator with her. So I learned a lesson, translator with her, so she doesn't necessarily have to speak English. She could just speak where she's comfortable, the Koyukon language, and have someone translate her. And just underscoring a point, however, that here is a master storyteller, absolute master storyteller. It's totally evident if you look at it, you read through this stuff. And something Robert observed in Stories Sharp as a Knife is that while oral cultures aren't necessarily totally annihilated, as we're pointing out, totally taken away, one of the first things that goes are the masters. And I think we see the rarity of the master storytellers nowadays. It's just an observation. Hopefully new ones will keep on springing up. Hopefully there are ones, like Tupac Shakur said, a rose grows in concrete. Even there isn't such a great ecology for oral culture, you'll find some gems. But I know we wanted to touch on the political, the advocacy realm. How do we get, one thing we're seeing in the university level is the Tlingit language. We're trying to, keep that going. And I saw Florence Shakely, my Tlingit language teacher, a little bit ago, Nora's sister. But how do we, what works? And I know I'd like to spend, unfortunately, just a little bit of time because I want to leave ample room for people to ask questions at the end, because I know there's a lot of folks here that probably have a some great thoughts and questions. So, but yeah, how do we advocate this stuff that we're talking about? Yeah, exactly. Philosophically, aesthetically, the pleasures of the stuff. We're coming to agreement on this, you know. But how do we get more people to appreciate it?
I'm a frustrated reader from our books. To kids, I want to volunteer. Last year, I spent most of the year calling Riverbend School. I think they were absorbed by their own activities, so they never returned my call. Or maybe they lost the call, I don't know. I wanted to go there because my great-grandchildren are there, and they liked being read to, especially about Raven, White Raven and the Poop.
Yeah.
They liked it. And let me see. The political side of our writing is, Dick is our advertising manager. And he sent my story, I think it was Egg Boat, to a library which was holding, they were calling for papers. And they said it didn't sound like English, so they rejected it. I wrote it so that maybe adolescents could read it from a different country. You know, different countries are exotic. And anyway, that's one experience that I was sorry. I felt bad. They don't like me. Anyway, I went on, and I discovered the differences between American literature and Tlingit literature. They have repetitions. I think Robert Zuboff is a good one for repetition. He will make a statement and he'll repeat part of it. And then Dick told me that European languages have repetition, or literature has repetition too, and I looked for it. You know, I looked in Homer, and, well, I have to look again, see if I could find it. Anyway, that's my experience with political things. I don't think Dick tells me all of the bad things that happen. He takes care of all of them.
Yes, we must protect her from these.
Thank you.
Nora mentioned review. I think most of our work has been pretty positively reviewed, but we got one negative review that was so great that I like to tell people about it. It was from some librarian somewhere who totally panned Ahashuka because these are just not like the European fairy tales that we're familiar with. And say, okay, she made that observation correctly, but what does that have to do with the price of stories in Tlingit? So she just couldn't see it. I mean, these are not European fairy tales; they're Tlingit oral literature, but people have their expectations. But let me mention two things that were very dear to us. One of the biggest problems, I think, is partly been political and blatantly racist, but also there's the idea of sometimes teachers are confused or their comfort level is not there. So we've done a lot of things to try and work with people so that they would be comfortable dealing with something which is strange. And I noticed when I was sent Robert's book to review, and I appreciated it for the first time, I was absolutely clueless on Haida. I mean, I didn't know where to pick up and where to hang on, because it's Haida literature, I find is so profoundly different from Tlingit. And I guess if I had to peg it with a word, it would be more mythic, where Tlingit is more legendary. I mean, you know, that Tlingit, and I don't know if this is a later development, because one of Swanton's storytellers laments that everything is about these crest stories these days, and it's sort of like it's some kind of a disgusting shift from the good old stuff. And so it may have been something happening in the 19th century, because, you know, there are other, in artwork, there's the shift from like Raven's Tail to form-lined blankets. And so I think we sometimes forget that in oral literatures, just as in written literatures, things come into vogue and they go out. And you know, television shows, you know, Westerns are big, and then it's whodunits and shoot-'em-ups and stuff like that. But anyhow, I said that this is really difficult. And secondly, where does it fit in the school year? Because I know that the teachers are hard put to find places to do things. So one of the things that we hit on was the idea of thematic comparative literature. So you can work a theme, like say conflict of loyalty, and then where you can pick whatever you want. Pride and arrogance is another one. I mean, how many Native American stories are based on things aren't what they look like? And then you can do this with popular stuff. I mean, you take the movies like The Karate Kid or something like that, and you could do it. And we actually taught a course like this. It was kind of fun, and one of our teachers did her paper on the Pirates of Penzance. It was this conflict of loyalty. I mean, gee, what, this guy's got a problem here to stay with the pirates or keep his word, and on it goes. But that would be one thing. Another thing we did that worked quite well were community retreats, where we'd start off like on a Friday evening with videotapes and popcorn and stuff, and then go all day Saturday and wrap up on Sunday. And we based these on the Joseph Campbell, Bill Moyer's Power of Myth series. And we liked the one on storytellers, because we had stuff for every concept that he had. We had Tlingit examples for, and we didn't have this for all of the cultures in Alaska, but we could do it very well for Tlingit, you know, with the idea of covenants and art and metaphor and the oratory and things. And what was really fun when we did these in several communities was not to go in to say, hey folks, we got something that you haven't seen before, but it was how to put a label on this, because a lot of the people had experienced this all their lives. And one guy I think it was in Cake, said, wow, this is what my uncle has been telling me all my life. And so, yeah, the great consultable moment, so that there wasn't anything here that he didn't already know, but he didn't know that he didn't know that he knew it. And so a great deal of comfort when the ability to conceptualize it and talk about it and it's that balance between kind of living it and knowing, so that how then you can fit it in the community. And I guess the main reason we got into all of these approaches was we were very disturbed that we can do these stories. They're out there orally, but people may not be telling them anymore. There's a language barrier. We can do the books, but they're not going to do anybody any good if they're still on the bookshelf. And there are still incredible amount of teen suicides, and this just breaks us up, because kids are killing themselves. And so what we wanted to do was make the old point that English teachers always do, is literature can be of help. You say, well, yeah, big deal. So, but it's true, so that we could say, okay, conflict of loyalty. It's one of our favorite themes. You don't know who to listen to, you don't know what to do, you're conflicted. Number one, it's okay to feel this way. This is something that it's part of life. And on the other hand, you're not the first person to feel this way. So, no big deal. On the one hand, it's a very big deal because you can end up killing yourself. On the other hand, it's not a big deal because everybody goes through this. But how can we deal with this? How can you find the balance? And that there are stories, very often in Tlingit, like the woman in the ice, the Glacier Bay history. And then you can plug these in thematically to wherever else you're dealing with it. And then, because that was when we found out that people didn't teach Huckleberry Finn for conflict of loyalty, or here's, Huck going down and convinced he's going to burn in hell because he's breaking the law by helping Jim, and or the Federalist Papers, okay, now you got states' rights versus the federal government. This is the founding documents of American culture. There's conflict of loyalty. How do you deal with these things? So trying to find a niche so that if you picked the themes, it could work into the curriculum where nobody's asking you to spend a year teaching Haida literature or something, but if there's somewhere that you're working with these things that you can conceptually fit it in. We've mentioned like literature and the environment. I mean, any of these things, I think there would be numerous ways. So part of it was to try and get this off of the bookshelf and get people talking about this and realize that these are, there are things here that can be therapeutic. We've also done this with groups dealing with healing, like the whole oratory, the speeches for the removal of grief, these kinds of things, so that they're very profound in coming to grips with grief. So those are just a couple of examples of, and I forgot what the question was, but I hope I answered it.
Yeah, remind me what the question was. Is how can we make oral literature more successful, more?
How do we bring it out? How do we get universities, K through 12, the politicians? How do we convince people that this stuff works?
Turn off the electricity. That's all it would take. You have to persist. Those weekend retreats that Dick mentioned probably worked because people were taken out of their normal circumstance and put in a place where listening to stories suddenly made more sense. My friend Hugh Brody spent a long time with the Dauenhauer people, Beaver Athabascans in northern British Columbia. He met an old man there, was talking to him about the alcohol problem. The old man said, alcoholism is easy to solve. The solution is the bush. In other words, you take people out on the trap line, they'll stop drinking because their lives depend on it. Either they'll sober up or they'll die, and given that choice, they'll usually sober up. But when they come back from the trap line, they may not choose to live as if they still were on the trap line. Well, the solution to literacy addiction is like the solution to alcohol addiction. As you learn to keep the stuff at a certain distance, not to become too dependent on it, and then you also have room in your life for real literature, oral literature, for those things which don't quite fit into books. I really think that we're doing a kind of holding operation here. I've talked about it as putting knowledge in the bank, waiting for the time when we need it and can draw it out. And I think that time will come.
That echoes the name of my dad's book on one of the clan conference, Will the Time Ever Come? My dad's joke used to be, yeah, it's named that way because we were just waiting for, will the time ever come for it to publish? And it finally did. So why don't we open up for just a few questions? We got about 10 minutes or so. Carol, do you want to repeat that? Whoa, can't take this out that far. Okay, I'll try to repeat it. Carol Brady just asked about creative writing and how to teach creative writing. Okay. You guys teach creative writing, right? Do you?
Just right.
Just right.
Well, I'll answer the other lady who was asking about how can I read or how can I learn oral literature. What I do is Dick and I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he makes the coffee and I read. I read whatever I could get a hold of that interests me. The last thing I read was AARP's Super Bugs. That scared me. Holy smokes, you can't even go to the hospital anymore. And I get up early so that, well, I just can't sleep anymore. You get to an age where you can't just stay in bed. Your back gets tired. You start thinking about things and you get up. So I read.
Well, I'll see what I can do with Carol's question. Some people that I've observed are really good teachers of creative writing in that they're very good at priming the pump and getting people going. Like Joe Bruchac is one that I admire a lot. I mean, he's got lots of exercises and stuff. I'm not very good at that. What I think I can do well when I teach creative writing is I assume that everybody is in the class is already writing something and I don't have to prime the pump, and then we can work more on stuff. So I function much better when somebody's got a first draft, and then we can go to town. As far as getting them to that first draft, I'm not all that creative. There are some great books out there, though. Kenneth Koch, or Koch, however pronounces his name, Wishes, Lies, and Dreams. I've done that with kids. I've enjoyed poetry in schools. Like fourth and fifth graders are great. They've got the technical skills. They can handle the pencil, and they haven't discovered the opposite sex yet, and they're not too concerned about their image. But after about fifth grade, it's downhill. And the little kids are hard, because they can't handle the pencil yet, so you have to do their personal experience stories and stuff. But they're very creative. I mean, they wrote stuff I wish that I'd written. So I don't know if that helps. As I say, I just like to get people together and then read their stuff, have somebody read it back to them. Then I can kind of go from there as to what we think is weak or strong. But I'm not that good at getting people start with the first draft.
Well, when I wrote those first 3 pages of my autobiography, I wrote in school. My children needed to learn about my family because they were all gone by the time I was 16. So I felt compelled to write about them and bring them alive.
Sure.
So I remembered what a good grade I had in school. I wrote 3 pages, so many pages, going on a page, I did real well. And so I started that in San Francisco one morning. And when I wrote that, I really considered something maybe I shouldn't, but it was all about, it brought back a lot of wounds or things in me, and I got so scared that I jumped for a week. And my husband wanted me to show this to his mother. And I wasn't too used to thinking of a mother-in-law, I don't know, I kind of kept that arm's length, because I guess I didn't want to interfere in my lifestyle or whatever. But she noticed that the way I wrote, that I didn't put something in there that would make you want to read on, because I would mention something that you hoped I would read explain way later down the line. So I really, she said, did you take creative writing? And I said, no, I didn't even never heard of it. She said, well, she did, and she didn't really make it. So, yeah, I'm really curious. Maybe I should sit in on the class.
Oh, you should write, write more. To summarize what Carol said, if I won't repeat everything, because what you said was very powerful and articulate, but I think the key things were the need, the desire. I mean, why write? That you've got a compelling reason that either you need to get it out of your system. So it can be therapy. You can still leave it in the closet, or you can come out of the closet with things that you want other people to read. So I think there's a therapeutic side. I find that dealing with grief, for example, a lot of my poems this last year were with friends who were dying, and it helped me work through that. You mentioned also sometimes you find some scary things there. There's a Flaubert has in his journals that every time he worked on Madame Bovary, he'd go and puke because it made himself sick to his stomach because he just couldn't stand it. But he wrote it, so that there can be very scary things there that. And that's one of the things, by the way, that you can use to get people started. I mean, either it can be pleasant, like close your eyes and think of a very pleasant place that you were, or just the opposite, something scary, something frightening. I mean, you can handle all of these things. Or as you say, in your case, a success experience. So you wrote 3 pages and they turned out all right. Why don't you go for the prize? Try and add a few more to it. I don't know if Robert, want to say anything, or should we get another question, or what do you?
I think we probably have time for one more question. Would be good.
There's 2 over.
Okay. Let's see. How about we get a question from you?
My name is Nina, and I'd like to thank the learned panel very much for sharing your experience, your insight, your wisdom. On the line of talking about how to get kids involved with culture and with writing and with literature, Dick and Nora came up to the Gaff School District where I teach about 9 years ago. It was monies we had from the VA Ed program. I can't remember what it was. What are we going to do with it? So I brought it up to the board meeting, and they said go for it. So I called them up, and they were there for 2 days, and I taught a 5th grade class, and I've had those kids for 2 years, and I knew what their writing was. Some of them were reluctant writers, but you cannot tell me. Nora and Dick, especially Nora, was there, and the poetry. We created a book of poetry. The poetry what they were able to pull out of children. I mean, I told the Clay Tower teachers, don't you ever say these children cannot write. They cannot do it. Here's the proof of the pudding. We had made a booklet. They had done, I think it was a 2-day workshop that they did. And if I can pull it off, I can come back again. So thank you very much for that.
Want to comment on that?
Love to go to Yakutat.
Do you want to?
No, I was just.
Okay.
You guys.
Cool. Morgan, quick question. Plus, I really need to take a bathroom break, so maybe after, if people want to stick around. Morgan.
When speaking about oratory, and you said maybe it's a holding place, books are, or you're talking about your challenges with the Raven stories translating, especially humor. And I see that all the time. I don't know how you're going to do it. You translate humor, I don't see how it's going to work. Why don't you think of video as a place to go, maybe as a primary deliverable for this content instead of the written word?
Who should we hire?
The problem, whether it's video or written, is you still got the translation, because these are materials told in Tlingit. So you're going to have, video would be great, but number one is none of them they're only audio recordings because most of them were done in the 70s. So I'm not arguing with the idea of video. I think it's great, but you still, if you're going to have it in with subtitles, for example, you've only made it one step remove as far as the translation process. If it's something that's told, originally storytelling in English or something, or in Tlingit, then that would be great. I mean, you'd get that live, but for the point of view of the translation, it doesn't make the issue go away.
Well, do you see it as a permanent medium? I feel like that sometimes you play the fiddle, right?
The only problem is the technology has changed a lot, and so we've got stuff that we have video recordings we can't play anymore. So that's the only problem. I don't know.
Well, I'm not going to say that having done production work on these things and been involved in computer technology, internet since the 80s, high-speed printed books printed on acetate paper are more likely to be existing somewhere, even if it's in the bottom of some digital box 100 years from now, than any of the video formats, and even digital formats like long-term preservation. I think it's important to get these printed on paper and do other things with it.
It's nice to have the ability to have sound, and so our Raven book will have CDs to go along with the story. So we'll have the Tlingit text, English translation, we'll have the original recordings. But as I say, most of these were recorded when we were broke and Nora was run down to J.C. Penney and buy a cheap tape. And so you have this precious stuff recorded on the crummiest possible tapes because we didn't have the equipment and there weren't little camcorders back in the day.
We didn't know the difference.
That was all there was.
Well, it's about 5:30, and I really need to take a break for the last hour and a half. And I'd love to stick around and talk to anyone, and if panelists, if you are so inclined, and anyone still has other questions. Seems like people had some thoughts. Thank you so much.